For most of his life, Troy Landry seemed untouchable. Viewers watched him wrestle massive alligators with calm precision, as if danger were just another part of breakfast. He didn't posture. He didn't panic. He simply showed up, did the job, and went home. On television, he became known as the King of the Swamp, a man defined by control, courage, and consistency. But what happens when someone who has mastered the wild loses control over something far more personal? What happens when strength no longer works the way it used to? And what does it mean when the greatest threats no longer come from the water, but from within your own body and your own family? By 2025, Troy Landry was no longer fighting just the swamp. He was fighting time, illness, fear, and something no hunter can ever prepare for, the possible loss of a child. Before fame, a life built on survival. Long before reality television turned Troy into a recognizable face, his life was already defined by risk. He grew up deep in Louisiana's bayou, where being Cajun wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was a survival system. The swamp wasn't scenery. It was work. It was income. It was danger with no safety net. In Troy's world, you didn't grow up dreaming of comfort. You grew up learning how to endure. You learned to read the water, how it moved, how it hid, how it warned. You learned to respect the weather, because ignoring it could kill you. You learned that animals were not entertainment. They were either food, income, or threat. Fear wasn't discussed. Pain wasn't dramatized. If you got hurt, you healed or you didn't. Complaining wasn't part of the culture. You showed up, even when your body was already tired from years of doing the same thing. This kind of upbringing creates a specific type of person. Not loud. Not reckless. But deeply stubborn. Someone who believes that quitting is more dangerous than continuing. Would you choose a life where danger is so normal it becomes invisible? And at what point does endurance stop being strength and start becoming denial? By the time audiences first saw Troy on Swamp People, he wasn't becoming a tough man. He already was one. The cameras didn't shape him. They simply revealed a lifestyle that had existed for generations. And yet, the swamp doesn't reward loyalty forever. It teaches resilience, but it never guarantees protection. Over time, even the strongest bodies begin to keep score, quietly, patiently, without mercy. When the body stops cooperating, the first warning didn't come as fear. It came as pain. By 2021, Troy was dealing with constant back pain. Not soreness, not fatigue, but the kind of pain that follows you into sleep and greets you when you wake up. It didn't announce itself dramatically. It crept in slowly, stealing comfort inch by inch. For a man whose identity depended on physical control, the realization was unsettling. His own body was becoming unpredictable. Eventually, the pain demanded attention. Doctors confirmed what years of hard labor had done. Surgery became unavoidable. When it worked, the relief felt unreal. Troy described it as going from non-stop pain to suddenly feeling nothing at all, a silence where suffering had lived for years. For most people, that kind of moment forces reflection. It makes you slow down, reevaluate, change priorities. Troy didn't. Because when you grow up believing endurance is your greatest asset, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. Slowing down feels like surrender. Rest feels like weakness. Then came 2022, and a diagnosis no amount of toughness can soften: prostate cancer. There was no dramatic breakdown. No public panic. No long speeches. Troy handled it the same way he handled everything else, quietly, with faith, surgery, and forward motion. He trusted God. He trusted doctors. And he kept moving. He survived. The public celebrated. Headlines framed it as a victory. Fans cheered the king's return. But survival isn't a reset button. Cancer doesn't erase decades of physical wear. Surgery doesn't restore youth. It simply buys time. So here's the uncomfortable question. Does beating illness mean you're safe, or does it simply remind you how fragile everything actually is? By the time Troy returned to television, he wasn't just hunting animals anymore. He was managing his health, monitoring his body, and pushing through because stopping still felt wrong. He had survived pain. He had survived cancer. On paper, that should have been the end of the story. But it wasn't even close. The king meets the law. In 2024, Troy faced something entirely different. Not physical danger, but legal scrutiny. He was cited for improper tagging of alligators, a regulatory issue involving paperwork and compliance. There was no arrest. No scandal. No criminal empire. Just a clash between traditional hunting practices and modern rules. Still, when your public identity is built on mastery and respect, even a minor citation feels heavy. Can a legend survive bureaucracy? To the public, rules seem simple. To someone raised in generational swamp culture, they often feel detached from reality. Troy had spent his life reading water and animals. Now he was navigating forms, deadlines, and evolving regulations. It wasn't dramatic, but it was stressful. And stress stacks. By this point, Troy was carrying years of physical strain, major surgery, cancer survival, and public scrutiny. None of it looked extreme individually. Together, it formed something heavier, a quiet pressure that never fully lifted. Still, none of it broke him. Because something far more devastating was waiting at home. The fear no one prepares for. Troy Landry had faced death in the swamp. He had faced it with animals stronger than him, faster than him, and completely indifferent to his survival. But nothing in the wild prepares a parent for watching their child struggle. When concerns about his son surfaced, the fear wasn't explosive. It was slow, suffocating, and relentless. The kind that doesn't leave when the sun comes up. The kind that keeps you awake long after the house goes quiet. Parents are wired to protect, to fix, to fight. But what happens when you can't wrestle the problem to the ground? What happens when strength doesn't apply? When experience doesn't help? For a man who had always believed effort could solve anything, helplessness was unfamiliar territory. And worse, it was terrifying. The swamp had rules. Illness had treatments. But watching someone you love suffer strips away control entirely. How does a man who built his life on certainty cope with uncertainty? How does a protector survive when protection isn't enough? Redefining strength. By 2025, Troy Landry was still standing. Still working. Still appearing strong to the outside world. But strength had changed. It was no longer about how much weight he could pull or how many gators he could land in a season. It was about endurance in a different form, emotional endurance, patience, faith, and the ability to stay present even when fear whispered constantly in the background. For the first time, Troy wasn't just fighting external threats. He was learning how to live with vulnerability. And that might be the hardest hunt of all. Is true strength measured by dominance, or by the ability to stay standing when dominance no longer applies? The king of the swamp was still a king. But the crown felt heavier now. Not because it was slipping, but because it carried responsibility, love, and fear in equal measure. And maybe that's the real story. Not the gators. Not the fame. Not the survival. But the quiet truth that even the strongest men eventually face battles they can't win with force, only with heart. Baby Crew, when strength becomes useless. The real tragedy had nothing to do with Troy himself. It was his grandson. Crew arrived into the world small and stubborn, a pocket of life fighting to be loud in a body that refused to keep up. In the first days, the family laughed at baby quirks, at tiny hands that clutched fingers like anchors. Then the color changed. The pediatrician's voice, even when soft, carried the weight of something like an indictment. Jaundice, swollen belly, tests. Biliary atresia, a phrase that felt like a sentence. Most people never hear the term until a doctor explains why their newborn skin is yellow or why their stomach is swollen. For Troy, whose career was built on wrestling meaning out of brute circumstances, this felt like a private form of betrayal. You could drag a 9-foot gator out of an oxbow and walk away bloodied and proud. You could mend a torn net, bait a trap, win the camera's sweet approval with a slow, dangerous grace. You could not, however, make a hospital clock run faster. Crew's condition worsened. His body failed to gain weight. His energy faded. The medical charts filled with appointments, with soft medical terms that meant the same thing every time. Without a liver transplant, he wouldn't survive. What do you do when the problem is too small to fight and too big to fix? Troy had spent a lifetime converting chaos into control. He had been raised on stories that shaped the same muscle, elbow grease and stubbornness, an insistence that effort equals outcome. That credo had worked for most of his life. It made him a figure people trusted. Steady hands in a canoe, sure eyes in a storm, the man who could coax food out of the swamp and victories out of peril. But the hospital, with its sterile light and its quiet bureaucracy, kept returning the one lesson Troy had never learned to accept. Some things are not about strength. He could wrestle alligators from moving boats, but he couldn't protect his grandson from biology. He couldn't trade places. He couldn't speed up the transplant list. All he could do was wait. The transplant system is cruel in its neutrality. You wait for a match. You wait for timing. You wait for someone else's tragedy to become your miracle. There is no skill involved. No strategy. No control. Just hope. For a man whose entire life had been about action, this was torture. How do you cope when your greatest strength, doing, becomes useless? Troy's coping looked like honesty. He posted updates that were stripped of bravado, photos of tiny socks, a hospital bassinet, a hand so small it sat in the curve of Troy's palm like a secret. He asked for prayers not as a performer but as a grandfather asking strangers to hold a child between their hopes. No dramatic appeals, no pleas for attention. Just the steady, blunt language of someone who finally knows what waiting tastes like. And that's when people saw him differently. Not as the king of the swamp, but as a man sitting beside a hospital bed, holding a tiny hand, waiting for a phone call that might save a life. Powerlessness doesn't look loud. It looks quiet. It looks like waiting. When the swamp gave up its dead. In April 2025, during the filming of a new segment for Swamp Mysteries, Troy and his crew made what might, under different circumstances, have been the scoop of a lifetime. Human remains, unearthed by the slow, indifferent erosion of the marsh. They weren't fresh. The bones had the patina of age, old burial grounds the swamp had swallowed and was now, reluctantly, returning. There was no mystery in the supernatural sense. It was history resurfacing, the land remembering what human memory had allowed to be buried. The timing felt heavy. While a baby fought for life in a hospital, the swamp revealed evidence of lives long finished. The contrast was a punchline without humor. Troy's reaction wasn't excitement. It was reflection. He spoke about memory, how mud and water hold stories longer than people do. What does the earth remember that we forget? He asked. Not for the cameras, but because he needed the question answered, needed it to help make sense of his private calculus of grief and hope. There was a quiet symbolism in the discovery. Beginnings and endings, hope and loss, life and death sharing the same season. Troy sat with that symbolism as if it were an old friend uncomfortable with silence. The swamp taught him, in a language he knew, that control had always been an illusion. You could dominate a place for decades and still be surprised by what it had kept. And for someone already living in emotional uncertainty, it became a reminder of how little control anyone really has. Especially someone who built their identity around control. The tragedy no one talks about. The real tragedy in Troy Landry's story isn't one event, it's inheritance. Not money. Not fame. Not a family heirloom. A mindset. A culture passed down through generations that says survival is a badge you wear by never stopping, by always moving, by refusing to let fear dictate your life. Generations of survival culture teach you to endure, to ignore warning signs, to normalize danger, to keep going because stopping feels weak. Troy didn't cause this. He didn't cause his cancer. He didn't cause Crew's illness. This isn't about blame. It's about cost. When strength becomes your default response to everything, you often realize too late that strength doesn't cancel consequences. It just delays them. Long before cancer, Troy lost his brother. He learned to bury grief and go back to work because that's what survival culture taught. Bury, mend, and keep going. Loss became a rhythm as much as a feeling. You mourn, you bury, you work. The cycle preserves you from being overwhelmed, but it also hardens you in ways that make some things impossible to see until it's too late. Crew never chose the swamp. He never chose risk. Yet he found himself caught in the aftermath of choices, cultural and chemical, familial and biological, he had no say in. There is a cruelty to that, the next generation paying in ways the first couldn't imagine. That's when the hardest question appears. Can love outlast a lifestyle built on danger? It's a question that's harder than it looks. Love is not merely affection. It is a system of care that must sometimes alter its habits. If loving someone means continuing the exact routines that threaten them, then the love is performative. When the routines themselves are the problem, how do you change a life without losing the self that life built? Troy's public face remained steady. On camera, he was still the same man viewers had trusted for years. Calm, capable, a steady presence amid chaos. But behind the image were layers that didn't make headlines. A brother lost, a body worn down by cancer and age, a grandson whose heartbeat might one day be missing from the family breakfast table. None of those details were sensational. Together, though, they formed something heavier than any gator Troy had ever pulled from the water. This is the tragedy people don't talk about, not sudden disaster, but slow accumulation. Day by day, decision by decision, the cost of endurance adds up. The crown was never heavy until now. Troy Landry never truly lost his crown. He simply came to understand what it weighed. Years of physical danger taught him how to dominate the swamp. But the last few years demanded something far more difficult: patience. Waiting. Loving without fixing. Watching a child fight for life while the world kept moving. Maybe the swamp was never teaching control. Maybe it was teaching acceptance. Troy began learning to sit with not knowing. He learned to create pockets of stillness where once there had been only motion. He found that people who loved him, fans, colleagues, family, were not only willing to watch but to hold space with him. Messages came in from viewers who had never met crew, prayers, small donations to medical funds, offers to be matched on transplant lists elsewhere. The public's affection was not a cavalcade of plastic sympathy. It was practical, sometimes awkward help that felt like a net being woven. If strength had once been about overpowering danger, it now invited a different question. Is strength about overpowering danger, or about surviving the moments when you can't? There were days when Troy would sit at the hospital window and watch the world beyond move as if nothing were happening. Commuters, errands, life's hum. Inside, his grandson's breath could change from steady to thin in a matter of minutes. The small hand he held was both anchor and reminder of his limitations. It was a humbling thing to find bravery in impotence, to show up daily, to hold a baby while surgeons planned and lists moved, to be a man publicly known for doing while privately practicing being present. And presence was a kind of strength he had never measured. Families gathered around crew the way marsh birds gather around fresh water, instinctively and without ceremony. They brought casseroles and medications, stories and quiet jokes about the family's old ways. Troy's daughters argued softly in hospital corridors about logistics and legacy, about how to keep old values alive without handing down the harmful ones. Conversations that had been avoided for years began to happen, not as confessions but as urgent rearrangements. What do you pass on when you mean to pass on courage but might be passing along a leash to danger? These conversations were raw. They involved admitting that what had once seemed heroic could be terminal. They involved acknowledging that toughness could become a refusal to adapt. For Troy, the hardest part was knowing how much of his identity would have to change. If he stopped modeling risk as the highest form of competence, what would remain of the man the cameras knew? Would he still be the hero, or simply an old man finally learning the art of surrender? There is a particular cruelty in adjusting your life to save a child. You must let go of parts of yourself that you have depended on. But letting go is not losing. In the quiet months between tests and calls, Troy began to discover that tenderness could harbor its own kind of courage. To sit quietly in a room night after night when you feel helpless is an endurance in itself. The transplant list and the waiting room of time. Waiting for a transplant is a lesson in suspended time. Days extend and compress. A single phone call can split a life into before and after. Troy learned to live on the edge of that call. He practiced breathing exercises he'd once scoffed at. He learned to find small rituals, a particular cup of coffee in the morning, a song to sing softly into crew's ear, the way he read an old fishing manual to pass time in the hospital chair. When the phone rang, it was both the most ordinary and the most extraordinary sound. For families like Troy's, the ring is the pivot of all probabilities. Sometimes it leads to a rushed, complicated joy. Sometimes it leads to more bitter waiting. For all the ways Troy had been in control of his stories, shaping scenes, doing the heavy lifting, this one moment was not his to command. So here's the final, lingering question the story leaves you with. If you were in Troy's place, what would you hand down to the next generation? The unbending courage to face danger, or the softer courage of restraint and care? That question lives in the rhythm of Troy's days now. It sits in the way Crew laughs when he chases Bubbles at the back porch, in the way Troy looks at the old net, deciding whether to mend it for fishing or to fold it away for a safer task. The swamp is still there, patient as ever, holding its secrets and giving them back on its own terms.